Okay, so it's nice to see everyone here. This is the last research exchange of the semester. My name is Stuart Russell. I'm the faculty director for Big Data. So it's especially appropriate that I'm introducing Hank today. I should mention that there is one more event of the semester, which is Putting Water Online, which will be here next Wednesday afternoon. And the CITRIS website has more information on that. So our speaker today is Hank Childs. He's at LBL. He's a member of the visualization group there and is an expert on exactly what you see here, visualizing data coming from very large simulations. He spent about 10 years at Livermore. He received his PhD from UC Davis, where he's also a senior researcher. He's the chief software architect for the NSF Exceed Center, and also a co-PI for the new SDAV Institute funded by DOE, a $25 million scientific computing institute. And he's going to show us all kinds of amazingly cool pictures today.
Oh, you're setting the bar high. Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, and I actually, and I apologize, Stuart, because we talked about it. I'm not the chief software architect for all of Exceed, but for one of the Exceed visualization centers that's focusing on big data. Thanks very much for inviting me to come give this talk. It's actually a really exciting time in the area of large data visualization. I've been doing research in this space for 12 years, and it's been 12 really interesting years, but the last year has been far and away the most exciting. And so at the end of this talk, I'll describe some of the things that are happening to make for so many of these research opportunities. A lot of these pictures show up later in the talk, and I'll talk about them then. Right now, I just want to talk about this one. This is a Rayleigh-Taylor instability. The idea behind a Rayleigh-Taylor instability is you have a heavy fluid and a light fluid, and gravity pulls the heavy fluid down into the light fluid. And so in this visualization, all the areas that were still pure heavy fluid at the top, we removed. All the areas that were still pure light fluid at the bottom, we removed. And we looked at just the areas where they were mixing. And so, you know, I don't know a lot about mixing fluids, but I made this picture, and it was really exciting when we made it. It was back in 2006. Livermore had far and away the fastest machine in the world, and this data set had 27 billion data points per time slice. And we thought that was staggeringly large. We ran around, I don't know if people would catch an Austin Powers reference, but we would go around and say 27 billion cells. We thought it was so amazing. And really before that, the only calculations we had seen had been on the order of 1 billion cells, and this was so much bigger. So now, fast forward to 2012, it's commonplace to see calculations that have more than 200 billion data points. In a few years, we're talking about simulations that have more than 1 trillion data points per time slice. And when I say data points, I don't mean over all the variables. I mean that's how many mesh elements there are. 1 billion different degrees of freedom along the mesh. Or a trillion. And so, you know, big data really creates, and when we're talking about visualization, two grand challenges. And so the first challenge is the obvious one. If someone hands you a terabyte or a petabyte or an exabyte, how do you load that much data? How do you process that much data? How do you render that much data, right? That you have to be able to look at data sets that are you know, at least in the order of petabytes to be in the game. And the second challenge is a little bit more subtle. The second challenge is, assuming you have a black box that can take in a petabyte and can produce an image, can we do anything meaningful, right? If you've got a petabyte of data and you're reducing it to 1 million pixels, you've lost a lot. You know, how are we going to make sure that we can reduce the complexity and actually give insight to the users? Because that's what we really want. And so I would argue bigger displays probably aren't the answer. We only have 50 million pixels here in our eyes. And we need to have techniques that actually give us confidence that we're preserving the integrity of the data and actually showing people what's happening in there. And so, again, there are two challenges. One is the scale challenge, and the second is the complexity challenge. So that's kind of a sneak preview. Here's an outline for the talk. I'm actually going to go through some introductory material because I'm not sure how familiar this audience is with scientific visualization and high-performance computing. I'll talk some about the challenges of visualizing large data and what the approaches are. And then I'm going to talk about a very specific algorithm because I want people to understand kind of what it looks like to design a really good algorithm in this space. And then again, as I said, there's a lot of exciting things happening right now when you start talking about the power constraints in the future of high-performance computing. And so I want to discuss some of those at the end. So, introduction to scientific visualization. I got this definition off Wikipedia. I hate it, but I'll read it. It says, the visualization of three-dimensional phenomena. It has some examples: architectural, meteorological, medical, biological. I'm a DOE guy, so I probably wouldn't pick those examples. I would talk about nuclear reactors, astrophysics is a DOE application, climate, but you get a sense of the sort of fields that are into scientific visualization. This is the part I really dislike, where the emphasis is on realistic renderings of volumes, surfaces, illumination sources, and so forth, perhaps with a dynamic time component. This is what I don't like, because it focuses on the computer graphics portion of it, and the computer graphics portion is a really important portion of it. But for me as a visualization scientist, I feel like I have a big toolbox with a lot of different tools, a lot of different algorithms, and there's a challenge every day when you have a data set to figure out which tools, which algorithms do you want to take and bring to bear to really understand what's in the data set. And somehow this definition minimizes that, and that's why I don't like it. But this is what you find on Wikipedia. It contrasts with the field of information visualization. Information visualization takes stuff that's maybe not in some X, Y, Z space, but maybe it's census data, and they make the sort of graphics that you see in newspapers. I guess that sounds kind of pejorative, doesn't it? There's a lot of interesting things happening in InfoViz as well, but I'm a SciViz guy. So there's a lot of different techniques, as I mentioned, and so the question is, which is the best? Why is it the best? And as a community, we're developing new techniques all the time. So let me show you what a few of these techniques are. I have 4 slides, and the format is something you've probably seen before, and on the left and on the right, maybe it's something that you haven't seen before. So this is plotting elevation in India and China and Pakistan. And so in the field, we call this pseudo-coloring. The idea is we've taken a scalar field, and we've assigned colors to it. And so things that are at sea level are green, things that are high up in the Himalayas are red. And you can look at this and you immediately know what the elevation is for that region. On the right is a picture that I made for my collaborator, Paul Fisher, at Argonne National Lab. And this is a nuclear reactor. I guess really it's the coolant around a nuclear reactor. He doesn't model the pins. There are 217 pins, each of these circles. And he's studying how the temperature comes, how the coolant pulls the high temperatures out of the pin and moves them down out of the assembly. And so you can see that it's very effectively pulling it out in the red regions and less effectively in the blue regions. I need one of those clickers. That was not a request. I hope no one runs from out there to bring me a clicker. So this is another way to look at elevation, where in this picture, we were doing coloring and showing pseudo-coloring and looking at the elevation at every point in that region. Here we're looking at a map, and the map has overlaid on it elevation lines. And so this line right here corresponds to 700 something, presumably meters. This line right here corresponds to 800 meters, and these other lines in between correspond to 720, 740, 760, and 780. So each of these lines is an ISO line. It's a line of constant value for the elevation field. And so if you take this, and so you see this all the time when you look at elevation maps. And if you take this same idea and you bring it to 3 dimensions, then you get surfaces. And so here's a star exploding. This is a calculation done by Stan Woosley down at UC Santa Cruz and some of his collaborators, and an image I made for him. And so this is an isosurface of a constant value of pressure, and then there's another isosurface surrounding it that's rendered transparently. And so it gives you quite a good feel in terms of what's happening with this star that's exploding. On the left is an X-ray. Everyone knows how an X-ray works. You emit X-rays, and things that are very dense, they don't go through, and things that are less dense, they do go through. And you put some film on the back, and you get a sense of what the densities are from the perspective of the emitter. On the right is something that's very analogous. This is a volume rendering. The idea with a volume rendering is you're doing a very similar process. You cast a ray for every pixel on the screen, and as the ray intersects the volume, for every location, every data point it intersects, you apply a transfer function. So you have the ability to map color and opacity to it. And if the color map went from black to white and the opacities went from 0 to maximum, it would be exactly an X-ray. But there's more degrees of freedom. So you can add color, and you can emphasize the regions that you think are important and de-emphasize the regions you don't think are important. In this case, this is another supernova explosion, this one done by Bronson Messer at Oak Ridge Lab. Let's see, I think this is my 4th and last example of a visualization technique. In the bottom left, this is a model of a Cessna in a wind tunnel. They're doing some interesting time-lapse photography. They drop some bubbles in where the wind is by the fans, and then they can see the entire path of the bubble before it exits the experiment area. And so in the world of visualization, we do this same thing quite often. We call them streamlines or path lines. And so in this case, this is another calculation done by Paul Fisher at Argonne Lab. They refer to this as the fish tank. And the idea is that they have hot air being pumped in one inlet and cold air being pumped in another inlet. The air comes in and spins round and round and round before ultimately exiting. And they asked a lot of questions about residence time and mixing and so on. I actually think this is pretty phenomenal. The reason I think it's phenomenal is that Argonne devoted some of their overhead dollars to build this experimental facility for the sole purpose of validating their code. And it's not often that you hear about an institution being so interested in making sure their codes are right. But anyway, the point is that this is a technique that allows you to understand what's happening, in this case with a vector field of the velocity, and where the previous three techniques were looking at scalar fields, temperatures, pressures, et cetera. And so I'm certainly not going to give an exhaustive listing of all the visualization techniques, but I want to give you a sense of some of these tools that are in the toolbox as I'm talking later about the infrastructure that's being that allows you to put these tools, bring them to bear to solve some of these problems. So visualization is a key aspect of the simulation process. There's three main phases. They're not always sequential. It's not always the case that you do problem setup where you identify your boundary conditions and what your assemblies look like and mesh it. And then later you go to simulation. And after you've simulated it, then you go to visualization. Sometimes you visualize things and you go back and you change the simulation, or you may even change the mesh. But some notion that there's this phase, then that phase is more or less right. And visualization, the reason people do visualization is for three primary tasks. And so the first is really for confirmation. People are doing debugging. They've run a calculation 1,000 times. They're running it the 1,001st. And they just want to make sure the train didn't go off the tracks. The next one is the sexy one. Everyone who's in the visualization field likes to think this is what we do. People use our stuff to explore data, and they learn new science, right? That's the part that we think is really cool. And this is the part that everyone thinks visualization is used for, which is to communicate results. So you show images in your PowerPoint presentations, you show movies, you make an XY plot. And so, they've had this, how do you say it? M-E-M-E, says meme? How do you say it? Is that, okay. They have this meme where it's like, the 6 2x3 layout. This is what my mom thinks I do. This is what my coworkers think I do. This is what I think I do, and this is what my customers think I do, right? They want to use it to communicate results, but we want to help people explore data. Okay, so visualization is actually a really interesting field. It lies at the intersection of a lot of computer science topics. Visualization, how do we create the objects that enable insight? Of course, computer graphics, how do we render and shade objects? Animation, as we add motion, we can fly around data. How do we do that right? Motion, blur, acceleration, et cetera. And then high-performance computing, the intersection between high-performance computing and visualization is really my area of interest, and that is the question, how do we process very large data sets? So there's a lot of really interesting fields that come together in the area of scientific visualization. So still going through my introductory material here, high-performance computing. Why are people doing simulations at all? Even when we're talking about giant supercomputers, simulations are sometimes more cost-effective than experiments. So I gave this example of nuclear reactors before. These are multi-$100-million efforts. If you can design a better one before you break ground, that's clearly a win, even if the machine that you did the simulation on cost $100 million itself. Climate change. We certainly could run an experiment where we all run our cars around the planet for 50 years. I think simulating it before we do that's a good idea. And here's yet a third astrophysics picture. That one comes from Stan Woosley at Princeton. And so that's something where we don't know how to run experiments. All we can do is simulation. So even when we talk about prohibitive costs of supercomputers, there are still times when they make sense. And the next question is, why do we need extreme scale? And so the answer is, at some level, kind of the bigger, stronger, faster story. If we have more compute cycles and more memory, then we get faster turnaround time and we get more accurate simulations. I think the real answer is that communities like the reactor community, the climate community, and the astrophysics community regularly hold workshops and say, what are our needs? And they always come back and they say more. But what they've been saying recently has actually been an exaflop. And so what is an exaflop? Well, flops are the metric for supercomputers. A flop is a floating point operation. The ability to do one floating point operation per second, that's roughly what my brain can do. A gigaflop is a billion flops. That's what this laptop can do. A teraflop was the great milestone of 1998. That's 1,000 gigaflops. A petaflop is where we are today. And an exaflop is where we might be getting to as soon as 2018. So it's a billion flops. These are some of the leading machines right now. The Riken K machine in the bottom right, is the fastest machine in the world. It's number one on the top 500. It's about 10 petaflops. It's going to be surpassed probably by one of these two machines. That's a screenshot from the machine room at the NCSA at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign Blue Waters machine. And so that's getting stood up. The one in the upper right is the Livermore Sequoia machine, clearly an artist rendering. But those two are both looking at being somewhere on the order of like 20 petaflops are going to be stood up later this year. I'd be remiss not to mention that we're just down the hill from one of the premier supercomputing facilities in the world. So Lawrence Berkeley is really a leader in the supercomputing space. So we are here, and what is this, like a third of a mile? It's uphill though, so it's not the best walk, but it has a great view when you get up. It is Berkeley Lab, where a lot of supercomputing experts live. The actual compute facility is not at Berkeley Lab. You have to drive down to Oakland. They don't have room for it up there, although they're building a facility and they're going to get a big new machine there in 2014. If you were to drive out to Oakland and to NERSC, the National Energy Research Scientific Computing Center, you'd find Hopper, which is the 8th fastest machine in the world and is able to do 1.28 petaflops, has 153,216 compute cores, 217 terabytes of memory aggregate over the core. So it's a really big machine. Okay, so thank you for enduring going through the background material. Let's talk about some fun stuff. This is a turbulence simulation done by PK Young and Diego Danzis. Turns out actually pretty good. You guys have a good projector. This is a 512 cubed portion of their data set. This is what people were able to calculate 10 years ago. And what they would do is they would make isosurfaces of isosurfaces of entropy and surround it by a volume rendering of dissipation. And so people were interested in looking at various things. They'd want to understand when do these red isosurfaces of entropy, which are called worms, merge up? When do they separate? When are they born? When do they die? And also, what's its relationship with dissipation? And so in this glorious era 10 years ago, you could actually visually inspect this. Visualization was the right tool for the job, and you could watch all of these patterns emerge. 5 years ago, people started doing calculations that are on the order of 1024 cubed, and then a couple years ago it was 2048 cubed, and now we're at 4096 cubed. And so this is, you remember I started the talk by saying there were two grand challenges. One was the scale and one was the complexity. This is a very complex data set, right? What we've done to date is no longer going to work. And so here are the four scales side by side. And in fact, this whole talk is kind of a teaser to give an intro to what goes on in this field, and I'm not going to dig in too deeply on this problem. But for this case, the answer was that visualization has become ineffective. I mean, the notion of actually trying to eyeball what's going on in individual worms, it just isn't possible. And so we actually developed a statistical approach that was feature tracking based to go and find when worms merged and divorced and were born and died, and actually did some really interesting science. And so this again is dealing with the complexity question. But I'd also say, since this is a 4096 cube data set, everything we did had to also operate in the scale space. So the solutions you come up with don't just have to be solutions for complexity; they also have to be able to work on very, very large data. Okay, so it's pretty easy to define big data for visualization. It's data that's too big to be processed, and I have three criteria here: in its entirety, all at one time, because it exceeds available memory. And so those three criteria, qualifications suggest three different approaches. And so if you don't want to process the data in its entirety, then people do things like data subsetting and multi-resolution approaches. And in fact, depending on what you want to do, this is a very appropriate thing. If you only want to look at, for example, a slice of the data, only process the data that's along that slice. Don't process the rest of the data. If you can set up what you want to look at in terms of a Boolean range query, pressure between this and this, temperature between this and this, then there's some research that happens that starts to get into database research about how to organize your data so that the amount of work you do is proportional to the number of records returned. Multi-resolution approaches would be something very similar to what you see in Google Earth or Google Maps, where you start at the United States, and as you zoom in, it gets more and more detail in the area that you're zooming into. If you want to relax the criterion that you look at the data all at one time, then you can think about doing streaming, so you process a piece at a time and you accumulate results. And if you want to relax this criteria that it exceeds available memory, then you can think about doing a parallel approach, and through parallelism you can get more and more memory and load the entire data in. And these approaches are not mutually exclusive, you can combine them, but really it's the parallelism approach that the community has gravitated towards. Part of the reason is because these data sets are being generated on large supercomputers, and so you have resources around readily available, i.e. the supercomputer itself, to process the data. And so let me describe more how this parallelism works. The idea, of course, is it's data parallelism. The data set is divided into, the data set can be divided into pieces, and there are multiple processing elements, or PEs, I'll use this abbreviation throughout the talk, which are different instances of your program. Maybe they live on different nodes of a supercomputer, maybe they exist on different cores within a node on a supercomputer, but each of them will operate on their piece, load it, process it, and render it. And then there's some sort of parallel coordination that happens to collect the results and make it look as if it was all processed on a single supercomputer. In terms of the processing, there also can be parallel communication. These things don't have to operate in an embarrassingly parallel fashion. But the truth of the matter is that many visualization operations are embarrassingly parallel. You can take your one little piece, you can process it without coordinating with the other processing elements, and then only at the very end when you want to render it do you need to collect up. That's not true for all of them, and for the ones where it's not true, that's where things get really fun, and I'll tell you about that in a few slides. So how far can data parallelism go? I led a study a couple years ago where we looked at data sets that we took some data and we upsampled it to what we thought would be tomorrow's data would look like, which is trillions of cells, and we used tens of thousands of cores to do it, and we varied over supercomputing environment, I/O pattern, data set, and we just wanted to better understand what the bottlenecks would be. Is the data parallel approach really going to be able to work on tomorrow's data? And we found that it works well for some algorithms and not for others, and really it wasn't very surprising that we found that I/O is the part that's not keeping up. I/O is the most expensive part of the visualization pipeline for almost any operation you do. So good, so now I wanted to discuss one of those algorithms that doesn't parallelize very well, and that's the algorithm of parallel particle advection. People often get caught up on this word advection. Just show of hands, how many people believe that advection is a word? Okay, and how many people have never heard the word advection before? Good. Okay. So advection is really, I think this is the community you see use it the most outside of the visualization community. It's the ocean modeling community, and they talk about the water, the fluids moving things around. So you can see down there it says the act of conveying. And so really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about particle advection is that we have some sort of velocity field. This, by the way, this is another one of our visualization techniques. This is called a hedgehog plot, where we have glyphs that show the orientation of the vector, and the size of the glyph deals with the magnitude. And so when I'm talking about advecting a particle, I'm just talking about displacing the particle in the direction of the hedgehogs. And so that loosely follows the paths that the hedgehogs would push it. More formally, we have some initial seed location where I started it right there, and we're constructing some integral curve, and the path of the integral curve is tangent to the velocity field at every point. And so you remember I showed you a streamline picture before. The streamline picture would show you the path that the particle took. And streamlines are the most common algorithm based on top of particle advection, but as I've emphasized several times throughout this talk, there's a variety of techniques, a toolbox that we have, and many of them are actually built on exactly this operation, advecting a particle. Okay, so the picture I showed you was actually a little bit misleading because when you think about how am I going to go ahead and do the work of advecting a particle, well, you can imagine you have a location, and you go and say that you want to evaluate the velocity field at that location, and whichever way is directing you, maybe, if you want to do something really simple, they call it an Euler step, you just take the velocity field at that location, move it a little bit, and then evaluate the velocity field again. If you want to do something more complicated, like some sort of Runge-Kutta fit, then you take various evaluations of the velocity field. And so the part that's a little confusing about what I did is you say, okay, great, I have a sense of how to do this. I'm going to go figure out what the velocity is at these various locations. The real situation is that you have some processing elements whose job it is to advect that particle, but it may not have the data at all. The data exists on some remote file system this data is too large to be loaded into memory, but it is decomposed into blocks, right? And so we need to have a strategy to get the particle and the data together so we can actually displace the particle, so we can move it. And so, here's a really simple strategy. We can have a strategy where we go to the file system and read a block, and then we have that block in memory, and then we can do an evaluation, and then we can read the next block and advect it, and then the next block and advect again. And I think I got lazy with my PowerPoint and I loaded the next 3 blocks at once, but you get the idea, right? And so we can just load these blocks one at a time, and this suggests a parallelization approach, right? The idea is we can partition the particles over the processing elements, and we load the blocks of data as needed. One thing that's really nice about this is it's indifferent to data set size. So when we talk about those trillion cell data sets, if we only have one particle to advect, we only need to load in the blocks that are actually necessary. And it's trivial to parallelize, right? If you give me a serial program that can do like the loading blocks on demand type scheme, I can parallelize it in 10 minutes, right? You just take the list of particles and add a modulo function with the number of MPI tasks. What's bad about it, though, is I/O, and I/O is a killer. So we're going to be doing redundant I/O across the processing elements, which is not good, and even within a processing element. So a processing element will load a block. It'll keep it in memory, but it has a finite amount of memory to deal with, and at some point it's going to have a caching scheme where it purges blocks, and at some point it will have to load those blocks again. And so that's a significant problem. Here's an alternate parallelization over data. So the idea is that we, instead of partitioning the particles over the processing elements, we could partition the blocks over the processing elements. And did that turn out okay? No. These 9 blocks are all green, and these 9 blocks are all orange, and these 9 blocks are brown, and these 9 are purple. But you get it, right? The blocks are assigned to different processing elements. And so at the beginning, processing element 1 has the data that particle resides in, and it will advect the particle until it gets to the boundary. And then processing element 1 will send the particle to processing element 2, and it will advect it until it gets down to processing element 4 where it terminates. And so this is, so the basic idea is the data is partitioned over the processing elements and particles are communicated as needed. What's really good about this is you only load data one time. So if I/O is our slowest piece, we're solving that problem. But the negative part is starvation. So imagine, well, I mean, if you have one particle, only one processing element can be working at a time. But if you have hundreds of particles or thousands of particles, or there are actually some use cases where you want to have millions of particles. I didn't really motivate that because that wouldn't make sense for streamlines, but for some of the other tools in our toolbox, you do want to have millions of particles. And imagine they were all right here. Well, this processing element would be doing all the work, and these guys would be busy waiting. And so that's clearly a bad idea as well. So 2 approaches. Parallelizing over data is good at I/O, has bad efficiency. Parallelizing over particles has bad I/O, but good efficiency. And this was the state of the world until about 3 years ago. And then David Pugmire came along, and there was a group of us that worked with him. I was one of them, who I think actually more properly saw this as a spectrum, where parallelization over particles was at one extreme and parallelization over data was at another extreme, and there was an opportunity to have hybrid algorithms in between. And so let me really quickly describe David's hybrid algorithm. The idea was it used the master-slave model of communication, so that's a common computer science idea where one process has unidirectional control over the other processes. What's really cool about it is the algorithm adapts during runtime to avoid the pitfalls of parallelize over data and parallelize over particles. So in my day job, I actually write visualization software that goes out to quite a large community. It's called Visit. We've had 200,000 downloads. We have a lot of users. And they ask me a lot of questions. And so the notion that there's an algorithm that just figures it out, and they don't have to know anything. They don't have to say, oh, should I be using parallelize over data? Should I be using parallelize over particle? They can select a new option that during runtime does the best of either. That's awesome, because I hate getting, I love getting questions from my users if I have any users in the room, but I get a lot of questions. And anything that's going to get me less questions, I like. So I think this is actually quite a good algorithm. And so the idea is you divide the processing elements into groups of n, and then you distribute the seed points amongst the groups. And in every group, there would be a master and some number of slaves. And so the master does exactly what you'd expect a master to do in a master-slave scheme. It monitors workload, and it makes decisions to optimize resource utilization. So it tells the slaves what to do. The slave may have a particle. It may say, well, load all the blocks you need to get that particle advected. Or it might say, there's another slave that has those blocks. Go ahead and pass them over. And so it makes those decisions. The slave responds to commands from the master, and when it's done, whether it's advecting a particle or loading a block or sending a particle, it reports status back to the master. So driving factors, you don't want the processing elements to sit idle. That's the problem with parallelize over data. You don't want the processing elements to spend all their time doing I/O. That's the problem with parallelize over particles. And what you really want to do is you want to do the, whenever you see quotes, that means there's a knob, right? You want to do the least amount of I/O that will prevent excessive idleness. And so here's the game plan. If no slave has a block, you have a particle to advect, and the master is aware of, and no slave out there has that block, well, someone has to load it, and so tell that slave to load the block. If some slave has that block, and it's not busy, well, then certainly have that slave process that particle. But if the slave is busy, well, then maybe you want to wait a while, right? If you were to go and read the block right away, that would be similar to parallelize over particles. But we want to throttle down on our I/O if possible. And if you've waited a long time, then you have another slave load the block and process the particle. So what does this look like in action? Here's this case where we have particles grouped together in one small portion of the mesh. There's a blow up of it. We might decide, the master might decide that it's going to have this slave be responsible for these particles, slave 0, slave 1, slave 2, and so on. And this is actually the key to the algorithm. When it starts going, it might tell some of these particles to hold back and wait and see what happens. So it might tell slave 0 to read this block and to start advecting, slave 3 to read its block and start advecting. But the other slaves, it might just tell them to sit out an iteration and see what happens. And so assuming that slave 0 advects its particles out of the block, on the next iteration, it can tell slave 1, instead of reading this block in, go ahead and pass your particles to slave 0 because it's available. But for slave 2, it might say, you have waited long enough, and this is clearly a hot block where there's a lot of interest in it. Let's go ahead and read that block redundantly. And so again, it's a trade-off between idleness and redundant I/O. So we did actually a really nice study behind it, the results of which I'm not going to show you here, but we found that this master-slave algorithm beat parallelize over particles and parallelize over data in all configurations. I'm going to show you just one example of it. This is coloring by the processing element that did the work. This is the seed location, and it actually only traversed 3 different processing elements as it went. That's bad because there were 128 processing elements in play, and so our efficiency was less than 3%. This is parallelize over particles. On the face of it, this looks like a great picture because we see so many different colors, but we actually know there are 3 different blocks being traversed, and each of these 128 processing elements read all 3 of those blocks, and so that's too much I/O. And then this is the master-slave algorithm, and actually did quite a nice job that 1/3 of them read this block, 1/3 of them sat on the sidelines until we needed this block, and 1/3 of them loaded that block. And so we had the same efficiency, but we had a lot less I/O get involved. And so it's the story of Goldilocks and the 3 bears. That one is too cold because there's not enough work being done. That one is too hot because we're doing too much I/O. And that one on the right is just right. So large data visualization analysis today, visualization analysis are critical pieces of the simulation process. There are lots of ways to look at large data. Data parallelism is the most common approach. And really, if I were to summarize, and I remember at the beginning of the talk I said I was going to talk about all the exciting things that are happening, and this is the transition point. The research to date has really focused on minimizing I/O and ensuring the scalability of algorithms, like the algorithm I just presented, trying to come up with a scalable algorithm that will go to high levels of concurrency. And those are still good and noble goals and something we all worry about, but the field is changing pretty dramatically. And the reason it's changing so dramatically, well, this is the most extreme example of it, which is exascale. I think the more general thing to think about is power-constrained high-performance computing. And so really the barrier to getting to ever higher levels of compute is power. And so if you think about an exascale machine, in 2009, the top machine in the world was the Oak Ridge Jaguar machine. It was 2 petaflops. It took 6 megawatts. in 2018 or possibly 2020, the Department of Energy has a goal to get to an exaflop machine, but their power budget is 20 megawatts. And so the reason why is a megawatt a year is about $1 million power bill. So if you have a 6 megawatt machine, you're paying a $6 million power bill. And the thinking is no one's going to be willing to pay over $20 million a year in the power bill. But this is actually a pretty extreme change, right? Because what we're talking about is we're talking about 3 orders of magnitude more compute coming from only 1 order of magnitude more power. And so to be able to achieve that sort of power savings, every bit of the simulation process, including visualization and analysis, is going to have to be rethought to be more memory efficient. Some other interesting things about this machine, there's going to be probably 1 billion cores, and there's going to be a lot more memory, but not as much memory compared to the compute. So we're going to have 100 times more memory, but 1,000 times more compute. And so we're going to have to be much more efficient. And so all of a sudden, people are thinking about writing totally different algorithms. Flops are free. You don't have to worry about how to write algorithms that are going to minimize the number of flops. What you want to do is you want to write algorithms that minimize the number of times you have to take data from in the cache to the registers. And you want to do as many operations as you can while it's in the registers. So what does that mean for visualization and analysis? Well, we're going to have to run in a mini-core space. And by the way, when you talk about a multi-core machine, you're talking about something like a quad core that has 4 cores in your CPU. A mini-core machine is something that has 100 to 1,000 cores. The example today would be GPUs. And for the visualization community, good news, we've done a lot of GPU work. We haven't done a lot of parallel GPU work, but we've done a lot of GPU work. And so at least we have a sense of how to do data parallelism in the mini-core space. We're going to have to consider concurrency levels into the billions. We're going to have a lot less memory per flop and per core. And we're going to have to do a lot of our work in situ. And so the idea behind in situ processing is that we take our visualization and analysis algorithms and we link them directly into the simulation code, and we carry out the operations we want to do before we ever write them to disk. And the reason why is because data movement within a node, when you take things from cache and into registers, that costs power. When you send messages between the nodes, that costs power. And when you send stuff to disk and read it back from disk, that costs a lot of power. So these all incur significant power costs, and we're going to have to think about what things look like in situ. And the answer is we don't really know how to do it. We have a lot of initial forays into the in situ space, but there's a lot more work to be done. And so here are some scenarios that we have as a community have considered. Visualization could be a service in this system. So the idea would be that each one of these squares is a node. There are 1 million nodes on the machine. There are 1,000 cores within a node. That's 1 billion. And so there are many physics packages running, advancing the simulation, and then there are various services that are being run. And services may deal with resiliency and fault tolerance, but there might be services for visualization and analysis. And so in this case, we'd be running in a mini-core environment in a very lightweight way, just using a few cores out of the 1,000 that might be available on a GPU. Or visualization can be done on a separate node. So in this case, we would have still the notion that we'd have many physics packages running, but the services would be used to actually take data that people are interested in and send it to one of the many nodes dedicated to visualization and analysis. That would certainly be better from our perspective because we wouldn't have to worry about contaminating their simulation code, but there's a power cost associated with doing that. Another idea, let's see, so this one says that we'd be running on hardware that looks like the same hardware they're using, but maybe we could have our own special visualization hardware. Or maybe we do some sort of triaging where we reduce the data and then we send it to specialized viz and analysis resources, maybe with a tiled display where someone's sitting and interacting with the data. Here's a configuration where we're doing some hybrid approach where we're reducing the data before we send it off. And so that reduction allows us to minimize the power costs involved, but we can totally tie these nodes up doing what we want to do without having to worry about affecting the entire simulation. The point I'm trying to make is not that we know what the answers are. We don't. The point is there are so many different configurations for us to consider, and we have this new axis that we haven't really thought about very much before, and that's power. And that's true for the entire HPC community, but it's true for us as well, and there's a lot of interesting research happening right now in this space. So that's it for me. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not it for me. This is just considering the scale issue, and we still have a lot of work to do to understand exascale data sets, tying back to my 2 grand challenges that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So now that's it for me. So thanks very much for your time, and I'll take any questions.
Thanks very much. Just to start off, you began with a complaint about the definition in Wikipedia. So why haven't you changed it?
Yeah. Good. Well, the honest answer is that I don't want to contaminate that page with my author name, and the reason why is I love it. You go there, and the top picture is my own. And I love that someone else put my picture there, and I think if I put my author name in, that, someone will think I put it in. So, oh, fake name. You see, I just need to get smarter. So yeah, I think I can change it. The community's split on what our value is. There are some people in our community that think that we should be making pretty pictures. And so this is a definition that comes from one of them. And you're right, I could go and put in what my view is, and maybe we could ultimately converge on the right thing. But I should say I'm not surprised by what it is.
Okay, so I'll ask another one.
Sure.
For those of us who cannot see, or for those of us who want to know whether any of our other senses could be marshaled along with our sense of sight to help us understand data, are there approaches that involve multisensory data realizations?
Yeah, definitely. So I had a slide where I had shown here are different areas that we have surface area with, and so it's computer animation and computer graphics, and certainly the virtual reality folks are one of those groups, and they're very big on immersive displays and getting immersive environments and getting visualization hooked into that. That's not exactly your question, but those folks do at least use sound quite often, and I think sound is a good one. I've seen some good demonstrations where sound can be used for visualization. I think we've all seen the ones where sound can be used, where you're in a helicopter flying through Vietnam or something. But in visualization, I think it can be used really well. I'll take this opportunity to poke a little fun at my colleagues at Sandia 10 years ago. They were talking about smell-o-vision. And I'm not sure how smell-o-vision could ever be successful, and 6 months later we stopped hearing about it, but I think there at least has been some thought about how to make good use of our other senses.
Also talk about, tactile is also one.
Yeah. So the question was about using the touch, and I agree. I actually have seen very little work on that, but to me it seems like there's an opportunity there. Part of the reason that visualization is so effective is because we have this incredible hardware in our brains that evolution has given us, and it can take in so much data so quickly. But touch is the same way, right? I'm not sure that I'm eager to go stand in some sort of Iron Maiden that can poke me, any way that that it decides. But we have that sort of input capability with touch, and that's part of what makes visualization so effective, is we can take in so much data.
And also, the nice thing about touch, it's two-way streams. So
Yeah.
you get feedback, and then you can insert whatever your elements are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so that's where our surface area with the virtual reality world really helps, right? And so there's a lot of work, actually work that I think with the Kinect, the Xbox Kinect is really taking off, is, how are we going to interact with this? And so I think that we're going to see a generation that's much more comfortable in that space than my generation, at least, because they're going to grow up doing it.
We have a question back there.
Well, he has a question and the microphone, so.
I possess the microphone. I'm curious, big data, of course, and what you've presented here, Hank, is all ISO surfaces, huge amounts of data that you're processing, and they're also physical state variables, right? Do you see any opportunity for trying to present visually non-surface, behaviors, emotions? I don't know. I'm just just things that aren't necessarily physical.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So I think if I understand the question, that's part of the difference between scientific visualization, where they're thinking about physical things, and information visualization, where they're thinking about, and I think the example I gave was the Census Bureau, the data collected from the Census Bureau. And so there's a lot of really exciting things happening in InfoVis right now. InfoVis, so one of the actually really nice things for scientific visualization is I put up this picture, let me go back to the beginning, where it was 27 billion cells, and so that means 27 billion means 3K cubed, and yeah, I'm putting it on 1 million pixels, and it all fits, it all works. And the reason why is, in fact, much of this data is smooth, and the notion of displaying all 27 billion cells actually isn't really necessary, right? We can make some, if these, 50 cells here get combined into 1 pixel, they all had more or less the same value, and it was okay. When you start talking about census data, you have to think a lot harder about how you're going to be doing those sort of combinations. And so I think probably the scientific visualization community is out in front in terms of thinking about how to deal with big data. The information visualization community is kind of held back because the visual display is so different. And yet we have some lessons learned that maybe we could be bleeding over into that community. But I think the holdup is the rendering.
I have the microphone
Great.
now. You just said the human brain has an amazing capacity for being able to load data
Yeah.
But I think what the human brain really can do very well is, out of very little data, recognize a pattern.
That's right.
And with too much information, at a certain moment, this pattern sort of gets lost. And you saw that very well in these 4 cubes that you showed.
Yeah.
The simple information, you can say, oh, wow, I can see what's going on, exactly. And with too much information, for us, the meaning that we put onto that image gets lost.
Yep.
So can we somehow, has there been any research done, and what is it exactly, the meaning that we translate or that we put onto images?
Yeah.
And can we translate that into the algorithms that would extract exactly that meaning out of the data?
Yeah. So fantastic question, and I think it'd be such an interesting direction. There are people who are hooking up brains with fMRI machines and trying to figure out, when you see this and you learn this, what's happening in there. And I'd say it's still its infancy, but it's really exciting work. And in fact, for our community, the folks that say, oh, like me, have the easier job, right? Because it's very easy to quantify. I took this operation that used to take this long, and now it takes this long. It's 10 times faster. This was clearly a good approach, right? But the notion of which picture actually leads to the insight, that's really hard, right? And so I think you're exactly right. There are some people who are out trying to do that. A lot of them are trying to figure out which are the best colors to use that we're going to recognize, not lose data. Let me try to say this way. I'm going to fail in doing it diplomatically. They've gotten sidetracked in some really interesting perception issues, but they've lost the overall goal of, how do we really measure when insight is obtained, and how do we do the best job of conveying something that's going to lead to those insights? And so I don't have a good answer for you, but I think there's some interesting work in its infancy right now.
No, I agree with you in the sense that sometimes there's just too much information for us to recognize a pattern. So we will not be able to give any meaning to it otherwise, but perhaps somewhere where computers might be able to take the seed that we use by giving meaning to to something, and actually being able to expand on that and make it into where they really begin to extract the meaning that we couldn't see anymore.
Well, and so I love the way that you phrase that, and I didn't do a good enough job describing this study, but I think giving you an example of what you just said was 10 years ago, when this was the resolution data we were dealing with, this did fit what nature gave us, and we could come up with those trends, and now it doesn't. But we remember the lessons we learned, and we remembered the sort of things we wanted to look for, and then we were able to automate it and have the computer do the job when the data got bigger. And so I think this is an example of the idea that you just said, and I agree with it. We had a question over there.
Yeah, so my comment is somewhat reinforcing what was just said.
Yeah.
I think focusing on data visualization.
Sorry.
Focusing on data visualization probably puts us in the wrong mind frame. Who wants to see the data?
Yeah.
What we want to see is the information that's contained in the data. So we really should talk about information extraction.
Yeah.
And if you really extract information in a concentrated manner, then 1,000 by 1,000 pixels are plenty good enough, right?
Yeah.
So the issue is really what kind of algorithms can you put between the raw data and your output display, and maybe if you have a variety of very flexible algorithms, so dynamically in time you can kind of steer how these algorithms take the data, reformat it, recombine it, and then put something on the screen, then we don't have to worry so much about whether orange is better than yellow. We
Yeah,
really
yeah,
should work
yeah.
on the concentration of the data into information, because that's where the essential work really happens.
Well, so I agree with the sentiment you're making exactly. I think there are times when, and so it's a question of how well are we doing? Have we done it optimally? Are we doing it? No, we're doing it suboptimally. How close are we to optimal? I'd say there are times that actually doing these visualizations is almost as close to optimal as we can get, and there are times when it's really far away. And so tying back to the earlier comments and yours, we're not doing a good job of figuring out when we're close to optimal and when we're not. And when we're not, what should we be doing to do it better? And so I agree with you. The second part of your comment was, can we put tools in the hands of users so they can make that designation and have more control over the process? Yeah, I agree. Right now, we tend to give them prepackaged operations like, I gave you a quick survey of, what was it? Pseudo color, isosurface, volume rendering, streamlines. We give them tools in the toolbox and they can go and do that. And oftentimes they can do a lot with that. And these are actually all interoperable pieces, but sometimes they're not. And sometimes they want to be able to say, if temperature is more than this and pressure is less than that and this and that, then make it red, and otherwise if, then blue, and so on. And there's no reason we couldn't do it. We don't enable those sort of modalities as much. Okay. Thank you again. Yeah.